October 1941, the Rasputitsa yields to General Winter. October 1941, the Russian autumn was already dying, and the fingers of General Winter began stretching across the land. In Leningrad, the wind no longer carried falling leaves. It carried silence. A heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the distant thunder of artillery and the muffled sobbing inside darkened, heatless apartments. The city, once vibrant, alive with music, science, and the pulse of revolution, had become a vast prison for more than 2.5 million souls. The German encirclement was nearly complete. Supply routes were being severed one by one. Trains no longer arrived. Roads turned into quagmires of mud or ribbons of ice. Food was running out. Bread, once plentiful in the bakeries, was now rationed into tiny, dark crumbs mixed with sawdust and sweepings, just enough to fool the stomach for one more day. In countless apartments, there was no electricity, no gas. People burned furniture, books, even doors, anything that would produce a feeble flame to hold back the cold and the despair. And while the city wasted away, on the German maps, Leningrad was merely a red dot encircled by rings, arrows, and military symbols. To Hitler, it was not a city. It was a symbol, a city that bore the name of Lenin, and one that in his mind had to be erased from existence. But there was one fatal flaw in the plan. While Leningrad starved in silence, a single artery still pulsed. Tikvin, a small town far to the southeast, ringed by dense forests, frozen roads, and vital railway lines. To modern eyes on a map, it looks insignificant. But in that moment, Tikvin was the last lifeline through which food, ammunition, and reinforcements could still reach the besieged city. To the Germans, Tikvin was not merely a strategic point. It was the final door left ajar in their stranglehold on Leningrad. If that door slammed shut, the city would not die in battle. It would die of hunger, and from the highest levels of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the order was unambiguous: close that door forever. Yet in Leningrad itself, no one spoke of surrender. Soldiers froze in their trenches. Civilians dragged corpses through snow-covered streets. Children, aged beyond their years by cold and hunger, learned far too early the sound of air raid sirens and the taste of want. But even encircled, broken, starving, Leningrad still breathed. And as long as it breathed, Tikvin had to become a killing ground. The strategic obsession, while Leningrad suffocated in silence and famine, far away in heated map rooms of the German High Command, the city's fate was discussed as if it were merely a logistical puzzle to be solved. Maps were spread across tables, pins marked positions, arrows traced axes of advance, and at the center of it all, one name: Tikvin. To Adolf Hitler, Leningrad was never to be occupied. It was to be annihilated. He feared what the city represented, the cradle of Bolshevism, an ideological fortress as much as a physical one. Rather than risk the meat grinder of urban combat, he chose a more terrible method: encirclement, isolation, death by starvation, cold, and despair. That mission fell to Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb. Facing him were some of the finest divisions the Wehrmacht still possessed in the opening phase of Barbarossa. Battle-hardened formations fresh from the triumphs in Poland, France, and the Balkans. Men who believed victory was already inscribed in history. But Russia was not Poland, nor France, nor the Balkans. Here the space was infinite. The cold was merciless, and the enemy learned quickly. Von Leeb received crystal-clear orders: push through the swamps, forests, and primitive roads of the northern sector, seize Tikvin, and sever the last significant railway feeding Leningrad. This was not merely a military operation, it was a deliberate sentence of death by starvation. The German staff officers knew, if Tikvin fell, the flow of food, ammunition, and fuel into Leningrad would be reduced to a trickle. Without it, the city could not survive the winter. Yet no map could solve the one problem that haunted them: German supply lines were already stretched to breaking point. Every kilometer gained meant greater distance from depots, greater fuel consumption, greater exhaustion. And ahead lay hostile wilderness, dense forests, bottomless bogs, dirt tracks that vanished beneath the autumn Rasputitsa. Still, the order was given. And in the trenches, in the mud-caked trucks, in the Panzer IIIs and Ivors plastered with mire, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht began marching east. They did not yet know it, but they were not marching toward victory. They were marching into the arms of General Winter and an enemy that had learned how to bleed without falling. The German advance through the Rasputitsa. In other countries, war was decided by tanks and aircraft. In Russia, it was also decided by mud. When Army Group North began its drive on Tikvin, it encountered something no general staff could command, the Rasputitsa, the season when Russian roads dissolve into a sea of slime. These were not roads, they were rivers of mud. German trucks that had raced across Europe like lightning now crawled like wounded beasts. Wheels spun uselessly, sinking deeper with every revolution. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Soldiers sank to their calves, sometimes their knees, with every step. Mud clung to boots like lead. The cold was already gnawing at fingers. Every meter gained cost, sweat, blood, and patience. The Germans improvised desperately, laying logs, planks, fascines, but nature seemed to mock their efforts. Supplies lagged. Fuel was lost en route. Ammunition arrived late, if at all. Food spoiled before it reached the front, and all the while, the Soviets watched. This was not yet organized grand resistance. It was something quieter, more insidious. Small detachments of the Red Army and armed peasants. The future. Partisans knew every trail, every shortcut, every patch of forest. They struck isolated convoys, blew improvised bridges, set fire to vehicles trapped in the mire. Each small attack delayed the advance a little longer. And in that phase of the war, time was not a luxury. It was a weapon. Every day lost in the mud brought winter closer. Temperatures plummeted, the ground hardened on the surface, but beneath the thin crust, the mud still waited, swallowing wheels, men, and illusions. The German soldiers began to understand. Russia did not yield quickly. Russia swallowed slowly, yet still they pressed on, because behind them there was no room for retreat, and ahead lay Tikvin, a small town, a simple name. But now the obstacle standing between the German war machine and the starvation of one of Europe's greatest cities, the desperate Soviet resistance. While the Germans fought the mud, the Soviets fought something worse, time itself. Every hour the enemy advance brought Tikvin closer to falling. And in the Soviet command, reality was brutal. There were not enough troops, not enough weapons, not enough time. Yet retreat was unthinkable. Hastily formed units were thrown into the line. Many soldiers had barely completed training. Some were still learning how to strip a Mosin Nagant when they first heard the rumble of enemy guns. But they possessed one thing in abundance. They knew what was at stake. To these men, Tikvin was not just a town, it was Leningrad's last lung. And that changed everything. They dug shallow trenches in waterlogged soil with spades that barely bit. They built defensive positions from sandbags, timber, the wreckage of destroyed homes. Everything improvised, everything fragile. But it was all that stood between them and annihilation. In the surrounding villages, the scene was apocalyptic. Wooden houses burned like tinder. Barns became strongpoints. Churches were turned into observation posts. This was no longer merely armies clashing. It was fathers defending invaders from reaching their families. It was ordinary people hurled into the maw of total war. Many of these soldiers were already half-starved. Some felt the first bite of real frost. Numb fingers, cracked lips, feet perpetually wet inside leaking boots. Yet no one stepped back. They knew retreat did not merely mean losing ground. It meant condemning millions to death by hunger. Soviet strategy was simple, almost cruel. Delay. Buy time. At any price. Every bridge held for hours. Every road blocked for a day. Every village turned into a small graveyard of steel and smoke. And when ammunition ran out, they fought with bayonets, with entrenching tools, with stones. Every meter yielded was torn from them, every withdrawal paid for in blood. Soviet commanders understood they did not need to win now. They only needed to hold until winter, fresh troops, and German exhaustion itself did the rest. And as the wind began to knife through coats and the first snowflakes mingled with the mud, resistance was no longer a tactic. It was national survival. The first falls, Mia and Kirishi. At first, it seemed the Soviets were succeeding in delaying the German juggernaut. Every village defended, every road denied, every forest ambush stole precious time from the Wehrmacht. But the German war machine, though mired and worn, was still terrible. And now it began to crush. The towns of Mga and Kirishi, vital nodes on the supply lines and railways east of Leningrad, became slaughter grounds. They were not famous capitals, they do not loom large in popular histories, but on that rain-soaked, mud-choked ground, they became gateways to hell. The Germans attacked with heavy artillery. Before the infantry appeared, the earth shook. Wooden houses exploded like matchsticks, roofs flew skyward, windows shattered into lethal rain, the air filled with smoke, dust and shrapnel. In Mga, the Soviet troops held as long as humanly possible, but the attacks came in relentless waves. Stukas screamed down. MG-34s swept open ground. Guns tore craters where streets had been. When the defenses finally cracked, the fighting became hand-to-hand among the ruins, among burning walls, among the remnants of homes and lives. The same horror unfolded in Kirishi. Every street was contested meter by meter. Every building became a miniature fortress. Every corner could be an ambush or a grave. Yet bit by bit, under ceaseless pressure, the Soviets were pushed back. When Maa fell, a heavy silence descended, because everyone understood what it meant. It was not just another town lost, it was a key. And when Kirishi too was partially taken, another blow struck morale. The path to Tikvin now lay more open. On German maps, the arrows advanced, the lines closed. On Soviet maps, the rings of encirclement tightened. Each lost town drew the noose tighter around Leningrad's throat. Each abandoned position made the ring bite deeper and far away. In Tikvin itself, people began to hear the rumors. Exhausted soldiers arriving, civilians fleeing with whatever they could carry, tales of burned towns, of German columns drawing nearer. The shadow that had once been distant now crept across the rooftops, and winter was coming ever closer. The final assault on Tikvin. By the second week of November 1941, the Russian winter was no longer a distant threat. It was a living presence, an ancient spirit awakening from the depths of the earth to reclaim what had always been its own. The air was no longer merely cold. It was a blade that flayed exposed flesh, leaving red wheels that swiftly turned white with necrosis. German soldiers, still clad in the grey wool uniforms designed for the gentle autumns of France or Poland, felt the north wind scourge their skin like a whip, creeping under hardened collars caked with frozen mud. Moustaches froze into icicles, eyelids stuck when they blinked, toes inside inadequate boots began to lose all feeling, the harbinger of gangrene that would soon claim limbs wholesale. The autumn mud, that treacherous enemy which had swallowed tanks like toys and turned roads into swamps, was now hardening into treacherous ruts hidden beneath a thin skin of ice that shattered under boot or hoof, pitching men and horses into hidden pools of freezing water. Snow began to fall, not in the gentle flakes of propaganda postcards, but in fine cutting needles that found every seam, every gap, piling on the shoulders of sentries until they resembled ghosts carrying their own graves. But the German High Command, under the relentless pressure of a Führer who saw in every map a vision of eternal glory, refused to grant the winter the respect it demanded. They knew, or should have known, the lessons written in blood by Charles V of Sweden. by Napoleon and his grognards, who had marched on Moscow beneath waving banners and returned as frozen spectres. To halt now would be suicide. Tikvin was not merely a provincial town with its log houses, onion-domed churches and modest factories producing rails for the vast Soviet network. It was the vital node, the last thread linking Leningrad to the heart of Russia. To sever it would condemn the city of Peter, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, to a slow death by starvation and despair. With Tikvin taken, the encirclement would close like an iron claw around Leningrad's throat, leaving only the half-frozen waters of Lake Ladoga as a fragile, exposed lifeline. Thus, though the initial, probing attacks had begun as early as 20th October, it was in early November that the final assault was launched, with the fury of men who knew time itself was the deadliest enemy. The sky was a lid of lead, so low it seemed to brush the frost-laden pines. There was no sun, only a dull corpse light that turned the world into shades of grey and filthy white. The silence before the storm was absolute, broken only by the distant clatter of tanks and the whisper of wind through the trees. Then hell descended. German artillery, emplaced on snow-dusted hills, opened in a thunder that made the ground shudder like the chest of a dying giant. Hundreds of guns, the 105mm and 150mm howitzers of 21. Corps, the heavy batteries of 12th Panzer Division, the dreaded Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, screaming like demons, unleashed a storm of steel and high explosive upon the town. Each salvo was a rolling thunderclap echoing through the forests, causing frozen birds to tumble from branches like stones. Black columns of earth and smoke soared skyward, mingling with the oily pall that hung like a shroud. Entire buildings collapsed in cascades of brick and timber, burying alive those who had sought refuge in cellars. The railway station, Tikvin's beating heart, was the primary target. Rails twisted like tormented serpents, wagons erupted in fireballs that lit the premature night, scattering glowing coals that melted the surrounding snow. Then came the lords of the air, the Stukas of the 8th Fliegerkorps, wings folded like birds of prey, dove with their Jericho sirens wailing a lament that chilled blood more than the frost itself. Bombs of 250 and 500 kilos fell with surgical precision, cratering markets, schools, makeshift hospitals. One struck the ancient monastery, its white walls and golden cupolas, a survivor of centuries of Tatar and Cossack raids. The domes collapsed in a cloud of dust and shattered icons, the great bell tolling a single funereal note as it fell, the requiem of Russia herself. Inside the town, chaos reigned absolute. Civilians, women in headscarves, pale-faced children, old men with white beards trembling from cold and terror, ran blindly through the streets. Many never reached shelter. They were scythed down by shrapnel that whined like hornets. Cellars filled to suffocation, the air thick with fear and urine, while mothers pressed children to their breasts, humming lullabies that barely drowned the roar of explosions. A doctor with blood-caked hands, operated by lantern light, amputating shattered limbs while the ceiling shook and dust fell like black snow. Partisans, hardened peasants forged by harsh lives, prepared ambushes in the surrounding forests, their faces carved with the fury of those whose ancestral soil was being violated. When the bombardment paused for cruel moments, pauses that offered hope only to crush it, the infantry advanced. Wehrmacht soldiers emerged from the fog like grey wraiths. Men of the 11th Infantry Regiment, the 21st Division, veterans who had marched from Brest-Litovsk, now dragged forward with faces encrusted in frost, bayonets fixed on Mausers, MG-34 teams scarcely able to feel their triggers. They advanced through the still smoking rubble, leaping craters filled with twisted corpses, the stench of burned flesh mingling with powder and charred pine. The Soviets did not retreat. They fought as though every meter of ground were part of their own souls. In the ruins, men of the 4th Army, mingled with factory militia and forest partisans, defended every stone, A young female sniper, rifle braced on a shattered parapet, picked off German officers with headshots of chilling precision. Sappers detonated charges on makeshift bridges, sending Panzer IIIs plunging into frozen ravines. 16-year-old boys with trembling hands hurled Molotov cocktails beneath tank chassis, immolating themselves in flames to halt the advance. Combat became primal, visceral. In one wrecked factory, Germans and Soviets grappled in dark corridors, bayonets glinting by lantern light. Grenades rolled down stairwells, bursting in sprays of blood and viscera. A German lieutenant, face blackened with soot, shouted orders in vain as a burst from a PPSH drum magazine cut him in half. A Soviet sergeant, mortally wounded, crawled forward with a grenade in hand, detonating himself alongside a machine gun nest. Night after night, the city burned. Flames danced on the snow, casting grotesque shadows of men fighting. To exhaustion, bodies froze in their final agonies, one soldier clutching the throat of his enemy, another staring wide-eyed at an indifferent sky. The wind howled through skeletal buildings, carrying the groans of the wounded no one could reach. Tikvin was not being captured, it was being martyred, sacrificed on the altar of total war. The fall of Tikvin. On 8 November 1941, when a pale, cold light finally broke through the low clouds, the swastika banner was raised over the charred ruins of the Soviet executive building. Tikvin had fallen. After weeks of uninterrupted slaughter, after a siege that had begun as a daring maneuver and become a meat grinder, the last pockets of resistance were crushed. The surviving Soviets, exhausted, uniforms torn and frozen stiff, withdrew into the forests or were taken prisoner, hollow-eyed specters barely able to walk. To the German command, General Erich Höppner and Field Marshal von Lieb, this seemed the victory that would alter the entire northern campaign. On the laminated maps in their headquarters, the pincers around Leningrad closed with geometric perfection. The Tikvin-Volkhov Railway, the last significant artery, was severed. Supplies for the besieged city, bread, ammunition, coal, would now have to cross Lake Ladoga in vulnerable barges or, when the ice thickened, in trucks sliding across a treacherous surface bombed day and night. Hitler, in his East Prussian Wolfschanze, received the news with a rare smile, issuing orders of the day proclaiming Bolshevism on its knees, Leningrad doomed to fall without a final assault, merely by the hunger already claiming thousands in its frozen streets. But maps are cruel liars. They show lines and arrows, not the smell of death or the taste of despair. The Tikvin the Germans now occupied was a ghost town, a calcified skeleton where the wind howled through empty windows and doors hanging on twisted hinges. There were no roofs to shelter troops, only black holes where snow piled in, drifts. Quarters were trenches, hacked into frozen earth, lined with straw stolen from burned barns. Men of the 8th Panzer Division, once proud in gleaming tanks, now shivered in improvised shelters, sharing tins of frozen meat thawed over damp wood fires that barely burned. The cold, Russian cold that plunged to 30 dig, 40 dig, penetrated everything. Boots split, weapons jammed, engines refused to turn. Gangrene claimed fingers and noses. Suicides became common among men who preferred a bullet to slow. Torment. Supply lines, stretched over 300 kilometers through partisan-infested forests, were a nightmare. Trucks bogged down in ice, ambushed by Soviet ski troops who appeared like white demons and vanished before retaliation. Thousands of horses died of cold and hunger, their carcasses devoured raw by men who no longer cared about the taste of frozen blood. Officers filed reports speaking of seasonal difficulties, but in letters home, if paper could be found, they confessed the truth. The winter here is not weather, it is a living enemy that eats us from within. And while the Germans tried to consolidate a position that bled men and material by the hour, deep inside Russia, something ancient, patient, and terrible stirred. Far from the front, in towns like Vologda and Yaroslavl, the Red Army was reconstituting itself with silent fury. Siberian divisions, Troops hardened by winters that made the present one seem mild arrived on trains that still defied the blockade. Men with Mongol features, narrow eyes and frozen beards, clad in sheepskin tulipes, and felt Valenki that kept feet warm on ice. They brought not just numbers, but certainty. They fought on home ground in their element. KV-1s and T-34s painted winter white, rolled from Ural factories in quantities the Germans could not imagine. Generals like Kirill Meretskov, glacial calm, and Andrei Vlasov, still loyal, still ferocious, plotted beneath dim lamps, sipping hot tea and speaking softly of the counterstroke to come. From the Stavka in a Moscow still smoldering from bombing came a directive that admitted no ambiguity. Stalin himself, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, dictated, "Tikvin will be retaken, even if we must pile corpses to the sky. Leningrad will not fall, the revolution will not fall, because Tikvin was not merely a town, it was the gateway, it was the warning, it was the point where the Russian winter, old ally that had destroyed entire armies before, bared its teeth, and those teeth were razor sharp. General Winter turns against the Wehrmacht. When the Germans planted their flag in the smoking ruins of Tikvin on 8th of November 1941, many officers allowed themselves a rare moment of chilled optimism. Reports sent to Army Group North headquarters spoke of decisive victory, of complete encirclement of Leningrad, of a campaign finally back on the rails of the blitzkrieg that had conquered Europe in months. They believed they had won the race against time, that capricious, treacherous Russian time which had already been the gravedigger of illustrious invaders. But in the depths of Russia, time is not an adversary one defeats. It is an implacable judge, an ancient ally of the land that turns against the foreigner with slow, inexorable fury that corrodes souls before it ever touches bodies. In mere days, not weeks, not months, but days, the winter descended like a biblical curse. Temperatures that had flirted with zero plummeted into abysses no German thermometer was prepared to register. 20 degree, 30 degree, 40 degree on clear nights when the stars hung like ice daggers in a black sky. The autumn mud, that viscous enemy which had swallowed axles and boots, froze into an iron-hard crust, treacherous and uneven, that shattered beneath a man's weight and cut souls like broken glass. The wind, the Siberian wind, that ancestral howl from the empty steppes, did not blow. It flayed. It stripped exposed faces, leaving red furrows that swiftly turned white and necrotic, as though the flesh itself surrendered. And the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, those invincible conquerors of Poland, France, the Balkans, discovered too late that their uniforms were a cruel joke. Thin wool greatcoats designed for the gentle autumns of the Rhine or the moderate winters of Belgium. Leather boots that cracked like dry bark. Wool gloves that lost heat in minutes, leaving fingers numb and useless. There were no padded parkas, no goose grease for waterproofing, no Valenki felt boots the Russians had worn for centuries. In occupied Tikvin men, huddled in half-buried cellars, wrapped in blankets stripped from dead peasants, burning broken furniture in fires that barely warmed outstretched hands. At night, the cold penetrated to the marrow, a damp, clinging cold that filled the lungs and made every breath agony. Men woke screaming, feeling their feet as dead blocks of wood, and many felt nothing ever again. Frostbite, the silent assassin, began its harvest. Toes blackened like charcoal, ears swelled and burst, noses rotted while men still breathed. Field surgeons with frozen instruments amputated limbs by candlelight, the saw's rasp echoing like a dirge in the ruins. Vehicles, the proud engines of the German war machine, betrayed their masters with mechanical vengeance. Engine oil froze solid, batteries died in hours, radiators burst like grenades. Panzer IIIs and IVs, once lords of the plain, became useless metal statues abandoned where the wind piled snow into burial mounds. Trucks, bogged down in treacherous ice, and when engines miraculously turned over, the fuel, delivered in drops after epic journeys through partisan forests, was never enough to warm engines, let alone men. Food, when it arrived, came as frozen blocks. Bread hard as brick, meat sawn with bayonets, soup that froze before reaching the mouth. Starving men gnawed boot leather, devoured horses dead for days. The taste of rot mingled with frozen blood. In the ruins of Tikvin, wooden houses now charred. Skeletons, churches without domes where the wind moaned like lost souls. Despair settled like a permanent guest. Soldiers who had marched singing from Berlin now wept silently, writing letters home that would never be sent. Mother, the cold here is not cold, it is living death. Officers with maps that no longer made sense watched their companies dwindle not from bullets, but from frostbite. Field hospitals overflowed with men whose eyes were glass, limbs gangrenous, souls shattered. The confidence, that Teutonic arrogance which had carried the Wehrmacht to the gates of Moscow, began to crack like ice beneath boots. Meanwhile, on the other side of the line, the Soviets did not merely endure the winter, they danced with it. Men of the Siberian divisions rushed from the Far East, now that intelligence confirmed Japan would not strike, arrived like white ghosts. Short, stocky, with Mongol faces carved by worse winds than this, narrow eyes that had stared down bears and blizzards. They wore sheepskin touloupes, thick as maternal embraces, valenki that let them walk on ice as though on clouds, fur hats with ear flaps. They knew the secrets: grease the face with goose fat, keep moving to circulate blood, dig snow caves that retained body heat. To them, 40°C was not the end, it was home. The Germans, trapped in their frozen snare, with supply lines stretched like ropes about to snap and attacked day and night by partisans on skis, felt the encirclement close not by men, but by winter itself. Every day in Tikvin was one day closer to the abyss. Victory, which had tasted so sweet days before, now tasted of frozen gall. General Winter had chosen his side, and he never forgave invaders. The Soviet counteroffensive is planned. As the wind howled across the vast frozen plains of northern Russia, carrying snowflakes that danced like vengeful spirits, something monumental began to stir in the depths of Mother Russia. For the first time since the black days of June, when the first blitzkrieg had torn through the borders like paper, the Red Army drew breath, not the thin air of panic, but the cutting air of resolve. Leningrad, that martyr city with streets full of hungry phantoms, stood on the edge of the abyss. Rations reduced to crumbs, children with swollen bellies, snow stained with blood on the pavements. But far away, in the frozen wastes where Siberia kisses the Arctic, endless trains, carriages encrusted with thick hoarfrost, chimneys belching black soot into the grey. Sky glided along the rails with grim purpose. Inside them rode thousands of men hardened like permafrost itself. These were not frightened recruits. These were the Siberians, wolf hunters, survivors of winters that killed entire herds, men who saw the cold not as enemy but as brother in arms. They did not arrive as ordinary reinforcements. They arrived as the embodied wrath of eternal Russia. Their commanders, Meretskov with his glacial calm and eyes that had seen the hell of Mannerheim's Finland, Fedyuninsky, ferocious and implacable, and looming over all the distant shadow of Zhukov, fresh from the flames of Moscow, knew that Tikvin was not a town. It was Leningrad's lung. To lose it forever would seal the fate of millions. Mass starvation, silent capitulation, the cradle of the revolution become a necropolis. In the Stavka, in cold rooms lit by weak bulbs, Stalin himself, voice hoarse with contained fury, dictated the order. Tikvin must be retaken at any cost, even if we must pile corpses to the sky. In improvised headquarters, log cabins buried in snow, maps spread on tables fashioned from ammunition crates, generals with frozen beards and trembling fingers plotted plans that admitted no elegance. There was no room for brilliant Guderian-style maneuvers. This was Russian war, brutal, frontal, crushing. Red lines on the maps marked the German Tikvin salient, a vulnerable bulge, overextended, bleeding men and supplies. Blue Soviet lines, once timid and retreating, now thickened with the arrival of divisions, the 4th, 52nd, 59th Armies, and above all the feared Siberian divisions, 65th, 78th, men who carried the scent of tiger and the quiet certainty of those fighting in their element. Reorganization was feverish, desperate. Shattered units, reduced to skeletons after November's fighting, were merged into cohesive blocks. Peasants with hands calloused from plows were handed Mosin Nagants and thrown into the cauldron. Workers from Leningrad's factories, eyes, bloodshot from hunger, yet burning with hate, formed militia battalions. Students, pale boys who had barely kissed a girl, swore oaths in voices trembling not from fear, but from cold. Officers with maps stained by tea and dried blood rationed ammunition. Each cartridge a promise, each grenade a miracle. There were no reserves, no retreat, only advance. The Siberians, in padded jackets that made them look like bears, taught their comrades the secrets of snow, how to crawl, leaving no visible trace, how to camouflage trenches with frost-covered pine branches, how to warm a machine gun barrel with urine to prevent freezing. At night, in dugouts hacked into frozen earth and lit by stoves hissing with damp wood, men listened to distant German guns, a far-off thunder that made snow fall from roofs. Each salvo was a reminder. The enemy still hammered, still tried to break spirit before body. But the Soviet spirit, forged in purges, famines, the endless nights of the Gulag, no longer broke. For the first time, fear gave way to something more primal, rage. Pure, distilled rage that made men with frozen feet swear vengeance, that turned exhaustion into fury. They knew what was at stake. Not abstract ideology, but mothers in Leningrad eating wallpaper paste to survive. Children with eyes too large for skeletal faces, the very soul of Russia threatened with extinction. In the white forests, ringing Tikvin like a frozen sea, partisans already struck German convoys, skiing like shadows, blowing. Bridges, leaving frozen corpses as warnings. And in the trenches, men sharpened bayonets on stones, cleaned rifles with oil that barely flowed in the cold, checked the drum magazines of PPSH submachine guns that would spit death in short, lethal bursts. The plan was simple in its brutality. Strike the flanks, envelop the salient, cut the already fragile supply lines, crush the Germans against the winter they themselves had invoked. No tricks, only relentless pressure, wave after wave, until the enemy bled out. Beneath a sky of lead that seemed to crush the earth, the Red Army prepared, not to resist, not to survive, but to strike, to retake, to avenge. Because Tikvin was not the end, it was the beginning of the turn, and winter, that ancient ally, waited only for the signal to devour the invaders utterly. The first blow on the ice. The dawn of December 1941 did not arrive like an ordinary sunrise. It infiltrated like a cold, silent blade, ripping darkness with a wind that whispered ancient prophecies of vengeance. There were no bugles echoing across the frozen plains, no fiery speeches from political commissars beneath waving red banners, only the oppressive silence of the Russian winter, that silence which swallows sound and soul, broken by the faint crunch of snow beneath Valenki and the distant creak of ice splitting in hidden ravines. The sky hung low, a vault of black lead studded with stars like indifferent eyes of forgotten gods, crushing the earth beneath its weight. Visibility was nil. One could barely see one's own hand stretched before the face. But to the Soviets, that frozen fog was not blindness, it was divine camouflage. In the frost-encrusted pine forests ringing Tikvin like a crown of white thorns, the first platoons moved like phantoms. The Siberians led, short, compact men with faces carved by winds from the end of the world, narrow eyes that had already stared death down in endless taiga. Their steps sank to the shins in deep snow, every movement calculated to preserve deadly silence, bayonets fixed on Mosin Nagants, glinting faintly beneath a hidden moon. The cold, that implacable ally, no longer betrayed them. It coursed through their veins like ancestral blood. Breath emerged in white clouds that vanished swiftly. Fingers ached dully even inside thick sheepskin mittens, but no one faltered. Behind them came the reinforced divisions, mingled with Leningrad militia, who carried in their eyes the hunger and fury of a besieged city. They spread through the shadows of the trees, using every trunk as living shield, every slight rise as natural trench. Partisans, those wolves of the forest who had bled the Germans for weeks, guided the way, whispering coordinates in Siberian dialects that sounded like spells. The plan, drawn by Meretskov in smoke-filled cabins, was simple in its brutality. Strike the vulnerable flanks of the German salient, envelop the overextended lines, cut the supply arteries already pulsing weakly in the cold. Then in the heart of that Arctic darkness came the first shot. A single dry, precise rifle crack echoed through the trees like the snap of a breaking bone. A German sentry, face frozen into a mask of exhaustion, collapsed without a sound, blood spurting hot for an instant before freezing on the snow. Then another shot, and another. In seconds, dozens, hundreds of rifles and PPSH submachine guns spat fire into the night. Bursts tore through the snow like blades, briefly illuminating hardened faces and white camouflage suits. The Germans, dug into positions won at such cost, were caught in the sleep of arrogance. Many still warmed tins of watery coffee over improvised stoves, dreaming of homes in Bavaria or Prussia, believing the subhuman Russians were broken, frozen, finished. But Russia does not break. She regenerates in the ice. The Soviet lines advanced in relentless waves, like tides of a frozen ocean. Men fell in the first meters, bodies bursting in red sprays against immaculate white, blood flowing slow and viscous, pooling into dark crystals as comrades stepped over the still warm corpses without a backward glance. There was no time for mourning, no room for mercy. Stick grenades were hurled into machine gun nests, exploding in showers of frozen earth, splintered wood and torn limbs. German cries, desperate orders, curses of terror, mingled with the distant howl of Katyusha rockets that screamed like banshees before crashing onto rear positions. The Germans replied, with the ferocity of cornered beasts. Pak-38 anti-tank guns spat fire from hillsides. 81mm mortars rained death in graceful but lethal arcs. MG-34s ripped the air with their chainsaw rattle, mowing down entire files. But something had changed irrevocably. Their hands shook in the cold, mechanisms jammed with ice. Fuel for the few remaining tanks was a distant memory. Morale, once unshakable, creaked like ice beneath heavy boots. At the forefront, the Siberians danced with death. They were white, shadows, crawling through deep snow, flanking positions that had seemed impregnable, emerging from ravines where no one expected them. When ammunition ran dry, came the knives, curved hunter's blades slitting throats with silent precision. Bayonets gleamed in hand-to-hand combat, piercing frozen greatcoats and hardened flesh. Every meter of ground retaken was paid for in rivers of blood that dyed the snow crimson. Every abandoned village became a slaughter pen where houses exploded in flames that barely warmed the air. And as the snow kept falling, fine, relentless, covering the fallen like a white shroud, a crystalline truth emerged from the carnage. The Soviet counteroffensive had begun, not as distant thunder, but as a precise stab to the invader's heart. And once begun, no force on earth, not tanks, not guns, not the Führer himself in his delusions, could stop it. Winter had awakened, and with it, Russia. White hell in Tikvin. Now the battle was no longer for roads or railways. It sank into the guts of the ruins, a visceral fight for the carcasses of a city that had once pulsed with life. Tikvin, that modest jewel of northern Russia, with its ancient churches of gilded onion domes now melted by fire, its markets where peasants bartered bread for vodka, its bells, that once called the faithful to morning prayer, had become an open-air ossuary, a labyrinth of wreckage beneath a shroud of ice that reflected flames like broken mirrors. Wooden houses gaped open like eviscerated corpses, roofs collapsed into makeshift tombs, windows bled shards carried by the wind like blades. The air was poison, burnt gunpowder, charred flesh, the sweet stench of death mingled with the metallic tang of frozen blood. The Germans clung to their final strongholds like shipwrecked men to flotsam. The railway station with rails twisted like severed veins, half-buried warehouses where supplies dwindled, crossroads that had once been squares now smoking craters. Every remaining building became an impregnable fortress, MG-42 nests on upper floors, snipers with Kar-98Ks in attic shadows, mines buried beneath snow that blew limbs apart in red sprays. Every corner was a death trap. Every shadow a potential Russian ghost. But the Soviets advanced like an inexorable tide, driven by a rage the cold only tempered, never extinguished. They came in agile squads, fragmented like partisans, no longer in rigid formations artillery could shred. One group distracted from the front, spitting PPSH fire. In short, lethal bursts, while another flanked through side alleys, crawling through ditches full of frozen corpses, infiltrating burned buildings where residual heat barely melted wall ice. Stairs groaned beneath heavy boots, roofs collapsed under snow weight, burying living and dead alike in indifferent avalanches. Inside the houses, those empty shells where Russian families had laughed and wept for generations, combat descended into the primal, the atavistic. Rooms became arenas where men stared, across meters before firing. Kitchens with cold stoves and toppled pots became trenches where grenades rolled like deadly toys. Narrow corridors echoed with labored breathing, grunts of effort, the wet sound of bayonets piercing flesh and bone. At point-blank range, firearms lost elegance, rifle butts crushed skulls, knives severed tendons, fists smashed noses in explosions of blood that froze mid-air. War, the impersonal machine of tanks and aircraft, regressed to what it had always been beneath. Man against man, hatred distilled into naked violence. The floor, mix of rotted wood, shattered concrete, treacherous ice, became slippery with blood and entrails. Walls soaked up impacts like sponges, spitting splinters that blinded eyes. Roofs gave way with dull crashes, burying combatants in avalanches of snow and debris. The Germans fought with the desperation of men who knew there was no honorable retreat. Veterans of France and Poland, iron crosses now frozen against skin, defended each. Room as though it were the Reich's final bastion. But the cold betrayed them. Numb fingers failed on triggers, mechanisms jammed, weeks without proper sleep weighed like lead on souls. Supplies were a mirage, ammunition counted round by round, food looted from Russian corpses, fuel non-existent. Then the Soviet artillery, Katyushas hidden deep in forests, 152mm guns dragged by tractors that defied ice, began to sing its hymn of destruction. Entire salvos crashed onto German positions, making the earthquake, whole buildings collapsing in cascades of brick and beams. Smoking craters opened where fortresses had stood, swallowing men and machines in instant graves. Yet German resistance was fierce, stubborn, worthy of legend, because they knew Tikvin was the key to Leningrad's tomb. To lose it meant opening the artery that could still save millions from starvation. But the Soviets knew more deeply, with the visceral certainty of those defending their own mother. Without Tikvin, Leningrad would succumb slowly, street by street, child by child, until Peter's city became a silent necropolis. It was desperation against desperation. But momentum now belonged to the Russians. Centimeter by centimeter, house by house, crater by crater, the city returned to its people. And winter, that silent, implacable judge, smiled from the shadows. For it always chooses the side of the land that birthed it. The German collapse. Amid the cold, suddenly, like a sudden fracture in a bone already weakened. By months of unbearable stress, something broke inside the German war machine. It was not a trench line that gave way dramatically, nor a fortification wall that collapsed beneath artillery, nor even a symbolic stronghold that fell in glorious flames. It was something deeper, more insidious, more devastating, human resistance, that stubborn spark which had carried the Wehrmacht from victory to victory across Europe, began to flicker out, not with a roar, but with a frozen whisper, a stifled groan, in the endless snow. The Russian winter, which until then had been merely a cruel adversary on the campaign's margins, now revealed its true face. That of an ancestral executioner who knew neither pity nor haste. Temperatures plunged into depths that defied comprehension, 30 digs, 40 dig, sometimes lower on clear nights when the air itself seemed to crystallize into invisible blades. The cold was no longer discomfort. It was a living malevolence that penetrated uniforms, flesh and soul. Tank, engines, those mechanical hearts that had roared triumphant from Poland's plains, froze into solid blocks, oil turning to useless stone. Weapons, faithful Mausers and MP40s, jammed in numb triggers, mechanisms locked by ice crystals in delicate gears. Heavy vehicles, trucks and half-tracks that once sliced roads like knives, now lay abandoned on frozen margins, buried under drifts, the wind piled with malice, true tombs of metal where dreams of blitzkrieg died silently, and with those betrayed. Mechanical monsters vanished the last illusion of German superiority. The soldiers of the Wehrmacht, men who had marched beneath June suns with conqueror's arrogance, who had sung victory songs in Paris and Warsaw, were now trembling spectres in Tikvin's ruins. Exhausted not just by combat, but by weeks of deprivation that corroded body and spirit like slow acid. Supplies, already arriving by thread through lines stretched to breaking, now barely existed. Convoys ambushed by invisible partisans. Trucks mired in frozen ravines. Luftwaffe aircraft grounded by weather that turned wings to dead weight. Proper winter clothing? A bitter joke. Thin summer greatcoats, boots that cracked like dry bark, gloves that lost heat in minutes. Many wrapped feet in rags torn from Russian corpses, in sweat-soaked newspapers frozen stiff, in any scrap that promised one more minute of feeling in the limbs. Bread arrived hard as brick, sawn with bayonets and softened in the mouth with scarce saliva. Soup? Distant luxury, replaced by melted snow water over fires of damp wood that barely hissed. At every pale, indifferent dawn, when grey light filtered through low clouds like a shroud, some men simply did not wake. They did not fall beneath PPSH bursts or grenade blasts. They died quietly, embraced by the cold that betrayed them. Eyes open to nothing, faces frozen into masks of surprise or resignation, bodies rigid as ice statues. Frostbite claimed its daily tithe. Toes blackened like coal, swelled and burst into pus-filled blisters. Ears hardened and snapped at a touch, noses rotted while men still breathed, skin split in deep fissures, bleeding blood that froze before it fell. Field surgeons with trembling hands and rust-frozen instruments amputated limbs by candlelight, the saw's rasp echoing like a lament in the trenches. And those who survived carried ghosts, the constant terror that the next sleep would be the last, that the body would betray before the enemy ever did. From distant, headquarters orders still arrived, telegraphed in codes that barely functioned on frozen radios. Hold position at all costs. Not one step back. Tikvin is vital to the Leningrad encirclement. Empty words from men warmed in Prussian bunkers who did not feel the wind howling like wolves through the ruins. Hold what exactly? A handful of charred rubble? Ashes blown by the wind? Frozen earth that hid mines and corpses in equal measure? Positions once impregnable bastions with machine gun nests. And anti-tank guns were now open graves where men shivered in snow holes, sharing tins of rotten meat and dreaming of a cigarette that would not freeze to their lips. Meanwhile, the Soviets tightened the noose like a garrote forged in the fire of vengeance. They had suffered the unspeakable, the Leningrad siege, hunger that turned men to shadows, losses that emptied entire villages, and now they did not hesitate. They attacked without pause, day and night, in waves that seemed to rise from the frozen earth itself. Small infiltration groups, Siberians on white skis, partisans who knew every ravine like the lines of their own hands, cut retreat routes, blew bridges with silent charges, ambushed convoys that were already ghosts of themselves. A German attempt to reorganize, crushed beneath Katyusha salvos that screamed like demons before impact. Radios failed in the cold, antennae coated in hoarfrost, batteries dead. Connections dissolved into static, leaving whole units isolated in pockets of despair, encircled by endless forests where Russian shadows moved like predators. German officers, once lords of war with precise maps and incisive orders, now felt the same poison eating their veins. Cold that dulled thought, hunger that clouded sight, primal fear that the 1,000-year Reich would end here, in a frozen hole at the end of the world. They no longer commanded invincible legions. They commanded broken men with blackened fingers on triggers, empty eyes staring at a horizon that offered no salvation. It was collapse, not in fanfare or declared defeat, but in fragments, a position abandoned in haste at dawn, heavy machine guns left behind because no one had strength to carry them. Tanks set alight so they would not fall intact into enemy hands. Documents burned in hurried fires, papers curling in flames that lit defeated faces. Some still resisted, dug into ruins that barely offered shelter, firing to the last round not for orders or strategy, but from animal instinct. To survive one more day, one more hour, to not die there, frozen and forgotten in Russian snow. But winter knew no mercy. It was Russia in its purest essence, the eternal guardian that had already devoured the armies of Charles XV, of Napoleon, and now feasted on Bismarck's heirs. And the Soviets, children of that same implacable land, had decided with certainty forged in suffering, Tikvin would not fall again. Never again. The noose tightened, the ice cracked, and the Wehrmacht, once invincible, began to dissolve into the endless white, like blood spilled on snow. The German retreat beneath snowstorms. It was not an organized withdrawal. It was flight amid chaos. The order finally came. Retreat. But to retreat from Tikvin meant facing the open winter itself. The sky closed completely. A blizzard descended upon the region like a gigantic white sheet, swallowing roads, paths, villages, and corpses. The world vanished a few meters away. There was no horizon, only ice, wind, and darkness. The German columns began moving west, choking on frozen roads. Broken down trucks were abandoned, guns left in snowdrifts, horses fell and did not rise again, and every vehicle left behind was a material and moral defeat. The soldiers marched in ragged files, bent double against the wind, coated in snow, looking like ghosts dissolving into nothingness. Many no longer felt their feet. Others carried wounded comrades on their shoulders, staggering like shadows. Some simply collapsed and stayed because there was no strength left to lift them. And all the while the Soviets gave no quarter. Red Army units pursued the retreating columns like wolves in winter. Small detachments appeared on the flanks, opened fire, struck convoys, blew bridges. The retreat became a march under constant fire. Every road became a corridor of death, every forest an icy trap. The Germans tried to maintain some order. Officers shouted commands, swallowed by the wind. Signals were lost in the snow. Maps became useless. Many units became separated. Others simply vanished into the white, never seen again. What remained of the heroic offensive of weeks before was now only exhaustion, ice, and despair. And in the midst of that retreat, a truth began to echo among the German soldiers. The Russian winter is not merely weather, it is an enemy, and it was winning. Tikvin liberated, the first victory of winter. When the last shots died away, there was no noisy celebration, only silence. A strange, heavy silence, broken only by the wind threading through the ruins. Tikvin stood, yet at the same time it was destroyed. The streets that had seen German columns pass now lay beneath snow stained with blood, shell casings, abandoned vehicles, and bodies frozen in their final gesture of struggle. The town had been reduced to rubble, but it was no longer in enemy hands, and that changed everything. Soviet soldiers walked among the shattered buildings in silence, exhausted, coated in ice and soot. Many could scarcely believe it. They had fought beneath extreme cold, hunger, exhaustion, and constant death. But there it was. Tikvin was theirs again. Some sat on broken steps, others leaned against cold walls. There were no victory cries, only labored breathing, groans of the wounded, and empty eyes staring into nothing. The price had been terrible. Thousands of bodies scattered in the snow, friends who would not return, youth buried beneath ice. But that victory carried enormous meaning. With Tikvin retaken, something fundamental occurred. The last vital link to Leningrad began to be restored. Supply convoys could, little by little, be reorganized. Food, medicine, fuel, small hopes began to flow again. The besieged city continued to suffer, but now it was no longer completely isolated. And for the first time since the German offensive in the east began, something symbolic occurred. The Wehrmacht had been halted, not by superior weapons, but by resistance, sacrifice, and by winter itself. Tikvin was not the largest city, it was not the greatest battlefield, but it was the first major defeat inflicted on the enemy on Russian ice. A crack in the aura of German invincibility, and once that aura cracks, it never fully mends. Tikvin was not merely a battle won, it was a warning to the entire world. Until then, the Wehrmacht had advanced with the reputation of being unstoppable. Poland, France, the Balkans, everything had fallen before the German war machine. To many, the Soviet Union would be just one more target, one more line on a map of conquest. But Tikvin said no. There, amid ice, snow, hunger and wreckage, something fundamental happened. The myth of German invincibility shattered for the first time in the Soviet winter, and that had enormous consequences. The recapture of Tikvin allowed partial restoration of supply routes to Leningrad. The siege would continue, cruel and long, but the city now breathed. Every sack of flour, every gallon of fuel that passed along those routes carried within it a fraction of the sacrifice of those who fell there. For the Soviets, Tikvin was not just a military victory, it was a psychological one. It proved resistance was possible, that counterattack was possible. That winter, once seen as an obstacle, could be a weapon. For the Germans, it was the beginning of a harsh new reality. The war in the East would not be quick, it would not be easy, and it would not be won with tanks and discipline alone. The Russian winter had spoken, and it would speak again at Moscow, at Stalingrad, at Kursk. But Tikvin was the first time, the first crack, the first sign, the first bloody warning that the enemy marching east would end up swallowed by it. Among frozen ruins and bodies beneath the snow was born a truth that would echo through history. Winter had chosen a side, and it was not Germany's. Epic, extended conclusion. The Battle of Tikvin. Tikvin was not the largest battlefield of the Second World War. It had no grand parades, no triumphant headlines at the time. But in the frozen soil of this forgotten town, history turned, quietly, brutally, forever. Here, in the winter of 1941, something extraordinary happened. The German war machine, which had crushed nations across Europe with terrifying speed, finally met an enemy it could not outmarch, outgun, or outlast. Not a new weapon, not a new strategy, but a people who refused to disappear, and a winter that refused to bend. Tikvin was not won by numbers alone. It was won by frostbitten hands still holding rifles, by soldiers who advanced through waist-deep snow, by men who fought not for conquest, but for survival, for their families, for a city that refused to starve in silence. The victory here did more than reclaim a town. It reopened a lifeline to Leningrad, a city dying inch by inch under siege. It proved that the Wehrmacht could bleed in the cold, and most importantly, it proved that the Eastern Front would not be decided by speed, but by endurance. The first German retreat in the winter of 1941 did not begin at Moscow. It began here, in the forests around Tikvin, in the snow-buried roads, in the silent ruins where the wind carried the voices of the fallen. This battle marked the moment when the Soviet Union stopped running and started pushing back. From that point forward, the war in the East changed. No longer a lightning strike, but a brutal, grinding storm that would last 4 years. Millions would still die. Cities would still burn. Empires would still collapse. But the illusion was broken, because after Tikvin, the world understood something cold and final. The winter had chosen its battlefield, and Germany was now fighting not just an army, but a land, a climate, and a people who had decided that here they would not be erased. And in that decision, bloody, frozen, unyielding, the long road to Berlin began. And yet, Tikvin was only the beginning, because wars are not decided in single moments, but in chains of endurance, and Tikvin became one of the first links in a long, brutal sequence. What happened there was more than a military maneuver. It was a psychological rupture. German soldiers who once marched with certainty now marched with doubt. Commanders who once planned offensives with confidence now calculated winters, distances, and exhaustion. On the other side, Soviet soldiers, who had known only retreat and loss, discovered something even more powerful than weapons. They discovered that the enemy could be broken, and that realization was worth more than 1,000 tanks. From that frozen battlefield, a new rhythm of war was born. No more swift victories, no more easy advances, only attrition, only sacrifice, only survival measured in blood and kilometers. Tikvin became proof that the Eastern Front would not be a quick conquest, but a graveyard of ambitions, because every German step further east from that moment on would be taken on borrowed time, borrowed warmth, borrowed fuel, borrowed lives. And somewhere in the silence of those snow-covered forests, beneath layers of frozen earth and iron, lies the true legacy of Tikvin. Not just broken vehicles, not just shattered buildings, but the broken illusion that this war could ever be controlled. It was there, under that brutal winter sky, that the invincibility of the Third Reich began its slow, agonizing collapse. A collapse that would echo through Stalingrad, through Kursk, through Kharkov, through the ruins of Berlin itself, and long after the snow melted, after the guns fell silent, after the last soldier left the battlefield, Tikvin remained, not as a symbol of destruction, but as a reminder that empires do not fall only by force, but by resistance, by endurance, by the refusal to vanish, and that sometimes history does not change in capitals or palaces, but in small, frozen towns where men choose to stand instead of disappear.